The flight back from Kuwait touched down at Fort Campbell 3 days earlier than scheduled, and all I could think about during the 14-hour journey was sleeping in my own bed in my house in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. After 9 months of desert heat, bad coffee, and sleeping on a cot that felt like it was made of concrete, I was ready to return to civilization. My name is Patrick Williams, and I had no idea that coming home would turn into the most bizarre nightmare of my entire life. I caught a ride from a buddy who lived near Nashville, threw my duffel bag in his truck, and spent the hour-long drive talking about absolutely nothing important, which felt incredible after months of military protocol and structured conversation. When he dropped me off in front of my house around 8 in the evening, the streetlights were just flickering on, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban neighborhood. I thanked him, grabbed my bag, and walked up the driveway with a smile on my face that disappeared the moment I tried my key in the lock. It didn't work. I tried again, thinking maybe the lock was sticky from lack of use. Nothing. I jiggled the key, twisted it both ways, pulled it out and examined it to make sure I had the right one. It was definitely my house key, the same one I'd had for the 3 years I'd owned this property. I tried the back door with the same result, then checked all the windows on the ground floor. Every single one was locked tight, and through the living room window, I could see furniture that definitely wasn't mine. There was a floral couch where my leather sectional should have been. Pink curtains hung where I'd had simple blinds. A collection of decorative plates covered the wall above the fireplace. My stomach dropped as I pulled out my phone and dialed my neighbor, Ed Morrison, an older guy who'd promised to keep an eye on the place while I was deployed. "Patrick, welcome back," Ed answered, sounding genuinely happy to hear from me. "You home safe?" "Ed, what the hell happened to my house? My key doesn't work and there's someone else's furniture inside." There was a long pause. "Oh man, I tried calling you, but I guess you were already in transit. That HOA lady, Brenda, she showed up about 2 months ago with a locksmith and some paperwork. Said you'd violated multiple association rules and the property had been seized for unpaid fines. I told her you were deployed, showed her the flag in my window and everything, but she said military service didn't exempt you from HOA regulations. I didn't know what to do, Patrick. I'm really sorry." My blood ran cold. "Brenda who? We barely have an HOA. I pay my dues every year, and I've never gotten a single violation notice." "Brenda Hutchinson. She became the HOA president about 4 months ago when the Johnsons moved to Florida. She went absolutely crazy with the power. Half the neighborhood has violation notices taped to their doors for things like lawn height and mailbox colors, but nobody got it as bad as you. She claimed you owed thousands in fines." I looked back at my house, at the warm light glowing through the windows, at what should have been my sanctuary after months of deployment. "Ed, are you telling me this woman is living in my house?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you. Moved in about 6 weeks ago." "Patrick, you need to call a lawyer. This has to be illegal." I hung up and immediately dialed 911. When the dispatcher answered, I explained the situation as calmly as I could manage, which wasn't very calm at all. She told me an officer would be there within 20 minutes. I sat on my front steps with my duffel bag, still in my uniform, and waited. Neighbors started peeking through their curtains. A few came out to welcome me home and express their shock at what had happened. Everyone had a story about Brenda Hutchinson and her reign of terror over the neighborhood. Mrs. Chen from across the street brought me a bottle of water and shook her head. She fined us $300 because our recycling bin was visible from the street on a non-collection day. We forgot to bring it in one evening. $300. She's absolutely out of her mind. Officer Bradley Kemp arrived in a patrol car, followed shortly by another unit. I explained the entire situation while standing on my own lawn, feeling more helpless than I had during any moment of my deployment. Officer Kemp listened carefully, took notes, and then walked up to the front door and rang the bell. The woman who answered was exactly what I'd imagined based on Ed's description. Brenda Hutchinson looked to be in her early 50s, with severely cut blonde hair that was styled in that specific way that screamed, "I want to speak to the manager." She wore expensive-looking athleisure wear and had the kind of artificial tan that came from a salon. Her eyes narrowed when she saw the police officers, then widened with theatrical innocence. "Officers, can I help you?" Officer Kemp gestured toward me. "Madam, this gentleman claims this is his property and that you've changed the locks without his permission. Can you explain the situation?" Brenda's expression morphed into something resembling sympathy mixed with smugness. "Oh, this must be Mr. Williams. Yes, I heard he was in the military. That's very admirable, truly. However, military service doesn't place someone above the rules of our community." Mr. Williams accumulated over $15,000 in HOA violations during his absence. The association exercised its legal right to place a lien on the property, and when the fines went unpaid, to take possession of the home as outlined in the covenant agreements he signed when he purchased the property. I stepped forward, my voice shaking with barely contained rage. "I never received a single violation notice, not one, and I was deployed to Kuwait serving my country. How exactly was I supposed to pay fines I didn't know about?" She pulled a folder from a table just inside the door and handed it to Officer Kemp. All violation notices were sent via certified mail to the property address. I have the tracking numbers right here. It's not my fault if Mr. Williams failed to arrange for someone to collect his mail. Officer Kemp flipped through the papers, his expression growing more troubled. "Madam, these violations include things like grass being a half-inch too tall, exterior paint being the wrong shade of approved beige, and holiday decorations being displayed outside the approved time frame. The fines are also escalating at a rate of $500 per day for each violation. All clearly outlined in the HOA bylaws," Brenda said primly, "which every homeowner receives and agrees to follow." "I never got any bylaws," I protested. "When I bought this house 3 years ago, the HOA was basically inactive. We paid $50 a year for neighborhood entrance landscaping, and that was it." Brenda smiled in a way that made me want to scream. "The bylaws were revised and approved by the board 6 months ago. All homeowners were notified. I was deployed 6 months ago." Officer Kemp held up his hand. "Folks, I'm going to be straight with you. This is a civil matter, not a criminal one. Madam, you're claiming legal right to be here through HOA enforcement. Sir, you're claiming this is your property and she's trespassing. I can't arrest anyone right now because there are legitimate legal questions about who has the right to be here. You're going to need to take this up with a lawyer and potentially the courts. So she just gets to stay in my house." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "For tonight, yes." "I'm sorry, but I strongly recommend you contact an attorney first thing tomorrow morning. If what you're saying is true, no HOA has the legal authority to seize property like this, especially from active duty military. There are federal protections in place." Brenda's smile faltered slightly at that, but she recovered quickly. "I have every document showing this was done properly and legally. I'm happy to provide them to any court." I wanted to argue more, but Officer Kemp pulled me aside. "Listen, I believe you. This smells wrong. But if I arrest her for trespassing and it turns out she does have some legal documentation, even if it's questionable, I could make things worse for you. Get a lawyer tomorrow, a good one, and document everything." I spent that night at a cheap motel off Interstate 24, lying awake and staring at the ceiling, trying to process what had just happened. I'd survived 9 months in a combat zone, and I was being defeated by a middle-aged woman with a superiority complex and a clipboard. The irony wasn't lost on me. First thing the next morning, I started making calls. The first was to my mortgage company, confirming that my auto pay had continued throughout my deployment and my mortgage was current. They confirmed that yes, all payments had been made on time. The second call was to the Service Members Civil Relief Act hotline, where a very helpful advocate explained that what Brenda had done was almost certainly illegal and violated multiple federal protections for active duty service members. The third call was to Mitchell and Crane, a law firm in Murfreesboro that specialized in property law and had experience with HOA disputes. I spoke with an attorney named Robert Crane, who listened to my story with increasing interest. "Mr. Williams, I'm going to be direct with you. What this woman has done is so illegal it's almost impressive in its audacity. The SCRA explicitly prevents this kind of action against deployed service members. Additionally, Tennessee law requires extensive documentation and court proceedings before an HOA can foreclose on a property, even for legitimate debts. The fact that she changed the locks and moved in while you were deployed suggests she knew exactly what she was doing and counted on you not being able to respond. Can you be at my office in an hour? I was there in 45 minutes. Robert Crane was a tall man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of confident demeanor that came from winning a lot of cases. His office was lined with law books and framed newspaper articles about high-profile cases he'd won. He had me sit down and walk through the entire timeline, from when I deployed to when I came home and found someone else living in my house. "You have any documentation about your deployment?" he asked. I pulled out my orders, my travel documents, and my discharge papers from Fort Campbell. He photocopied everything, then made several phone calls while I sat there. I caught phrases like egregious violation, federal protection, and possible criminal charges. When he hung up, he leaned back in his chair. "Here's what we're going to do. First, I'm filing an emergency motion with the court for immediate possession of your property. Given the SCRA violations alone, I expect we'll get a hearing within 48 hours. Second, I'm contacting the Tennessee Real Estate Commission and the State Attorney General's office because what she's done potentially rises to the level of fraud and theft. Third, we're going to pull every single HOA document filed with the county to see if this board revision she mentioned was even legitimate. How much is this going to cost me? I had savings, but lawyer fees could drain an account fast. For an active duty service member whose rights were violated while deployed, I'll do the initial filing pro bono. If we recover damages, which I fully expect we will, we'll take our fee from that. This case makes me angry, Mr. Williams. I'm a veteran myself, Marines, and what this woman did to you while you were serving is unconscionable." We shook hands, and I felt hope for the first time since arriving home. Robert filed the emergency motion that afternoon. By the next morning, we had a hearing scheduled for 10 o'clock the following day at the Rutherford County Courthouse. Robert also discovered some very interesting information. The HOA bylaws that Brenda claimed had been revised and approved by the board had never been filed with the county clerk's office, as required by Tennessee law. Furthermore, the HOA board that supposedly approved them consisted of exactly 3 people: Brenda Hutchinson, her sister Linda Mayers, and a woman named Carol Patterson who, upon being contacted, claimed she'd never attended a single meeting and hadn't even known she was on the board. "This gets better," Robert said when he called me with updates. I pulled the certified mail records she provided to the police. Every single violation notice was sent while you were deployed, and they were all sent to your house address, not to any forwarding address or alternate contact. She knew nobody would receive them. And here's the real kicker. 3 of the violations are dated for the same day, which means she literally went to your house while you were overseas and made up violations on the spot. Can we get her arrested for this? Let's win the hearing first, get you back in your house, then we'll talk about criminal charges. I've already been in touch with the district attorney's office. They're very interested in this case. The night before the hearing, I stayed at Ed Morrison's house. He and his wife insisted, refusing to let me spend another night in a motel. Over dinner, they told me more about Brenda's neighborhood reign of terror. She'd been fining people for everything imaginable. The Hendersons got fined for having a basketball hoop visible from the street. The Ramirez family received violations for their children's toys being left in the front yard. One elderly man, Mr. Cooper, had been fined for his grass being uneven after he'd suffered a heart attack and couldn't mow for 2 weeks. "Everyone's terrified of her," Mrs. Morrison said. She threatened to foreclose on the Hendersons too when they said they wouldn't pay the basketball hoop fine. "After what happened to you, people started paying just to avoid the hassle, even though the amounts are ridiculous." "That's extortion," I said. "That's exactly what it is," Ed agreed. But nobody wanted to fight the HOA in court. It's expensive and time-consuming. We all figured she'd eventually calm down or someone would vote her out. Well, she picked the wrong house to steal. The next morning, I put on my dress uniform and met Robert at the courthouse. The hallway outside the courtroom was crowded, and I was shocked to see at least 20 of my neighbors there, all waiting to get into the hearing. Ed gave me a thumbs up. Mrs. Chen offered an encouraging smile. Even the Hendersons and the Ramirez family had shown up. Brenda arrived with her own attorney, a nervous-looking young man who kept adjusting his tie and shuffling papers. Brenda herself was dressed like she was attending a country club luncheon, complete with pearls and a dress that probably cost more than my entire deployment wardrobe. Judge Patricia Morrison, no relation to Ed, called the hearing to order at 10 sharp. She was a stern-looking woman in her late 50s who had a reputation for not tolerating nonsense in her courtroom. Robert presented our case first, walking through the timeline of my deployment, the lack of proper notice, the violation of the SCRA, and the questionable legitimacy of the HOA's actions. He submitted my deployment orders, the photocopies of Brenda's violation notices, and the documentation showing the HOA bylaws had never been properly filed. "Your Honor," Robert concluded, "this is not a case of an HOA properly enforcing legitimate rules. This is a case of an individual using the pretense of authority to steal a deployed service member's home." Miss Hutchinson waited until Mr. Williams was overseas and unable to defend himself, manufactured violations, sent notices she knew would go uncollected, and then seized his property without any court oversight whatsoever. This violates state law, federal law, and basic human decency. Brenda's attorney, who introduced himself as Timothy Vance, stood up with considerably less confidence. "Your Honor, my client was acting in her capacity as HOA president and following the procedures outlined in the association bylaws." Mr. Williams did receive notice, even if he failed to arrange for that notice to be collected. The HOA has a right and a responsibility to maintain neighborhood standards. Judge Morrison looked down at the papers in front of her. "Mr. Vance, I'm looking at these violation notices. One is for grass being 14 inches tall when the limit is 12 inches. The fine is $2,000, escalating by $500 per day. Another is for an exterior door being painted hunter green instead of forest green. The fine is $3,000. Are these accurate? Those are the fines outlined in the bylaws, yes, Your Honor. And where are these bylaws? I don't see them filed with the county. They were approved by the board 6 months ago. Mr. Vance, Tennessee law requires HOA governing documents to be filed with the county clerk. They're not here. Do you have copies? He fumbled with his briefcase and pulled out a document that looked freshly printed. Judge Morrison took it and flipped through the pages, her expression growing more severe. This document is dated 6 months ago but wasn't notarized until 3 weeks ago. It also shows signatures from a 3-person board, one of whom has submitted an affidavit stating she never attended a meeting or signed any documents. Mr. Vance, are you aware your client may have forged signatures on a legal document? Timothy Vance's face went pale. Your Honor, I was not aware of that. I'm only presenting the information my client provided. Brenda stood up, her voice sharp. Your Honor, I demand the right to speak. Sit down, Miss Hutchinson. You're represented by counsel. This is ridiculous. I was enforcing the rules. Just because he's in the military doesn't mean he gets special treatment. Judge Morrison's eyes could have cut glass. Miss Hutchinson, federal law explicitly provides special protections for deployed service members, specifically to prevent situations like this. Sit down and be quiet, or I will hold you in contempt. Brenda sat, but her face was red with anger. The judge turned to Robert. Mr. Crane, what is your client seeking? Immediate possession of his property, removal of all liens and claims against the property, compensation for his losses including temporary housing, and a restraining order preventing Miss Hutchinson from any further contact with Mr. Williams or his property. We also ask that the court refer this matter to the district attorney for potential criminal prosecution. Judge Morrison nodded. Mr. Williams, please stand. I stood, my heart pounding. Mr. Williams, thank you for your service. I'm issuing an immediate order granting you possession of your property. Miss Hutchinson has until 5 o'clock this evening to remove herself and all her belongings from the premises. If she's not out by then, the sheriff will remove her. All HOA liens and fines against your property are hereby declared null and void. I'm also issuing a restraining order preventing Miss Hutchinson from coming within 500 feet of your property or contacting you in any way. Relief flooded through me. The neighbors in the gallery broke into applause until the bailiff called for order. Furthermore, the judge continued, I'm forwarding this entire case file to the district attorney's office for review of possible charges including fraud, forgery, and theft. This is one of the most egregious abuses of HOA authority I've seen in my 20 years on the bench. Miss Hutchinson, if you have any sense at all, you'll get yourself a better attorney, because you're going to need one. The hearing ended and I walked out of that courtroom feeling like I could breathe again. Neighbors surrounded me, shaking my hand and congratulating me. Ed clapped me on the shoulder. Mrs. Chen was actually crying with happiness. Robert pulled me aside. We're not done yet. I'm filing a civil suit against her for damages, and I expect the DA will pursue criminal charges. But for now, you're getting your house back. At 4:30 that afternoon, I stood on my lawn with a sheriff's deputy as Brenda Hutchinson carried boxes out of my house and loaded them into a moving truck. She refused to look at me, her face set in an expression of bitter resentment. The deputy made sure she didn't damage anything on her way out. When the last box was loaded and Brenda climbed into her Mercedes, I finally walked back into my own home. The place was a mess. She'd rearranged everything, painted several walls without permission, and even replaced my kitchen appliances with cheaper models, probably selling mine for profit. I documented everything with photos and videos, knowing Robert would need them for the civil case. It took me 3 days to get the house back to some semblance of normal. Ed and several other neighbors helped me move furniture, repaint walls, and track down some of my belongings that Brenda had apparently put in a storage unit. My leather sectional was there, along with my TV, my gun safe, and boxes of personal items. She'd literally tried to erase my existence from my own home. 2 weeks later, Robert called with an update. The district attorney had filed charges against Brenda Hutchinson. The list was extensive: fraud, forgery, identity theft for forging Carol Patterson's signature, theft, and several counts of extortion for the fines she'd collected from other neighbors. The DA was also investigating her finances, as there were indications she'd pocketed the HOA dues that neighbors had been paying without using them for any legitimate neighborhood expenses. "It gets worse for her," Robert said, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "3 other families in your neighborhood have come forward with similar stories. She didn't seize their houses, but she extracted thousands of dollars in bogus fines under threat of foreclosure. The DA is adding those to the charges. She's looking at serious prison time if convicted." "Good," I said simply. The civil suit took longer, but Robert was confident. We were suing not just for the cost of restoring my house and my temporary housing, but for emotional distress, violation of my rights under the SCRA, and punitive damages. Robert estimated we could see a settlement in the 6-figure range. 3 months after that first court hearing, I was settling back into normal life. I'd reconnected with friends, started a job at a logistics company in Nashville, and was finally feeling like I was home. The neighborhood had held an emergency meeting and voted to dissolve the HOA entirely. Nobody wanted anything to do with it after Brenda's abuse of power. We'd continue maintaining the neighborhood entrance on a voluntary basis, and that was it. On a Tuesday morning in late September, Robert called me at work. "Patrick, you sitting down?" "Should I be?" "Brenda Hutchinson just accepted a plea deal. She's pleading guilty to fraud, forgery, and extortion charges. She'll serve 4 years in prison, pay restitution to all the families she defrauded, and she's permanently banned from serving in any HOA leadership position ever again. As part of the deal, she's also agreed to settle our civil suit. You're getting $120,000. I nearly dropped my phone. "You're kidding." "Not even a little bit. The check should arrive within 30 days. She's liquidating assets to cover it, including selling her house. She's losing her house because she tried to steal mine. That's poetic justice right there." It absolutely is. "Congratulations, Patrick. You won." After I hung up, I sat at my desk for a long time, processing everything. I'd gone from coming home to a nightmare to getting justice, my house back, and compensation for what I'd been through. More importantly, Brenda Hutchinson was going to prison, and she'd never be able to do this to anyone else. That evening, Ed and Mrs. Morrison invited me over for a celebratory dinner. Half the neighborhood showed up, turning it into an impromptu block party. Someone brought a grill, someone else brought beer, and kids ran around playing while adults talked and laughed. It felt like what a neighborhood should be: people who looked out for each other, not people living in fear of some petty tyrant with a clipboard. Mr. Cooper, the elderly man who'd been fined for uneven grass after his heart attack, came up to me with tears in his eyes. "She was trying to take my house too," he said quietly. "Said I owed $8,000 in fines. I was going to sell rather than fight her. But when you won, I got a lawyer too. She's paying me back every penny plus damages. You saved my home." I shook his hand, not trusting myself to speak without getting emotional. The Hendersons told me they were getting their basketball hoop fines refunded. The Ramirez family was getting back the money they'd paid for toy violations. In total, Brenda was paying restitution to 14 families in our neighborhood alone. The investigation had also spread to her previous neighborhood in Brentwood, where apparently she'd pulled similar schemes before moving to Murfreesboro. As the sun set and the party continued, I sat on Ed's back deck with a beer and watched fireflies blink in the growing darkness. Ed joined me, handing me another cold one from the cooler. "You ever think about how different this could have gone?" he asked. "All the time. If Judge Morrison had been less sympathetic, if Robert hadn't taken the case, if I hadn't known about the SCRA protections, she almost got away with it. But she didn't, because you fought back. A lot of people wouldn't have been able to," I pointed out. "If I hadn't been in the military and had those federal protections, if I hadn't had some savings to hire a lawyer, if I'd been scared or intimidated." She counted on people not fighting back. "That's how people like her operate." Ed nodded thoughtfully. "Well, she's paying for it now. 4 years in prison, that's real time. Not long enough in my opinion, but it's something." The criminal trial was surprisingly quick. With Brenda's guilty plea, there was no lengthy court battle. She appeared before Judge Morrison again in November for sentencing. I attended, sitting in the gallery with Robert Crane beside me. Brenda looked different than she had at the first hearing. The expensive clothes were gone, replaced by a simple gray suit. Her hair wasn't perfectly styled. She looked smaller somehow, diminished. When the judge asked if she had anything to say, she stood and read from a prepared statement. "I apologize for my actions. I believed I was enforcing neighborhood standards, but I went too far. I accept the court's judgment." It was the most insincere apology I'd ever heard. She didn't sound sorry. She sounded annoyed at being caught. Judge Morrison clearly thought the same thing. "Miss Hutchinson, I've read the pre-sentencing report. I've reviewed the evidence. I've spoken with the victims of your crimes. You didn't go too far in enforcing neighborhood standards. You deliberately defrauded multiple families, forged legal documents, and stole a deployed service member's home. You showed no remorse during the investigation, and your apology today rings hollow. I'm sentencing you to 4 years in the Tennessee prison for women, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. During your probation, you are prohibited from serving in any capacity in any homeowner association, condo association, or similar organization. You will pay full restitution to all victims as outlined in your plea agreement. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Honor," Brenda said quietly. "Bailiff, remand the defendant into custody." I watched as they led Brenda Hutchinson out of the courtroom in handcuffs. Several other victims from the neighborhood were there, and we all felt the same sense of relief. It was over. She couldn't hurt anyone else. The restitution check arrived in December, just before Christmas. $120,000. I deposited it and then sat in my living room in my house, on my leather sectional that I'd rescued from storage, and thought about what to do with it. Part of it would go to upgrading the house. New appliances to replace the ones Brenda had swapped out. Maybe a new deck in the back. But the rest, I decided, would go into a legal defense fund for service members dealing with HOA issues. Robert and I had discussed creating a foundation to help other deployed military personnel who faced similar situations. With this money as seed funding, we could actually make it happen. I called Robert the next day and pitched the idea. He loved it. "I've been thinking about something similar," he said. "There are probably dozens of cases like yours happening across the country. Service members get deployed, HOAs take advantage, and they don't have the resources or knowledge to fight back. We could make a real difference. We spent the next few months setting up the foundation. The Williams Crane Foundation for Service Member Property Rights launched in March with a website, a legal hotline, and partnerships with several veterans organizations. The local news covered the story, and within weeks, we were getting calls from service members across Tennessee and neighboring states dealing with HOA issues. Not all of them were as extreme as what I'd gone through. Some were simple disputes that could be resolved with a letter from an attorney. Others were more serious, involving foreclosure threats or bogus fines. In each case, we either provided advice, connected them with attorneys in their area, or, in extreme cases, took on their representation directly. By summer, we'd helped 23 service members resolve HOA disputes. 3 cases resulted in criminal charges against HOA board members for fraud or extortion. The foundation was making news, and state legislators started taking notice. In August, a Tennessee state representative introduced a bill that would strengthen protections for deployed service members against HOA actions and require additional oversight of HOA boards. The representative specifically cited my case and the foundation's work as inspiration for the legislation. I testified before the state legislature in September, explaining what had happened to me and how common these abuses were. The bill passed with overwhelming bipartisan support and was signed into law in October. It required HOAs to verify the deployment status of homeowners before taking any enforcement action, mandated court oversight for any foreclosure proceedings, and increased penalties for HOA fraud. Sitting in the gallery watching the governor sign that bill into law, with Robert beside me and several other service members we'd helped in attendance, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: pride. Not the pride of military service, which I'd always had, but pride in what we'd built from a terrible situation. Life in the neighborhood returned to something better than normal. Without the oppressive HOA oversight, people actually got to know each other. We organized voluntary neighborhood cleanups. Someone started a community garden. The kids had room to play without fear of violation notices. It was what suburban life was supposed to be. Ed Morrison became one of my closest friends. We'd get together every couple of weeks for dinner or to watch football. He and his wife treated me like family, especially around holidays. Mrs. Chen kept bringing me homemade dumplings, insisting I was too thin. The Hendersons' kids asked me about military vehicles every time they saw me. I had a community, a real one, built on mutual respect instead of fear and arbitrary rules. I even started dating someone I met through the foundation. Her name was Hannah Cole, and she was a paralegal at a veterans advocacy organization in Nashville. We'd connected over a case involving a Navy sailor whose HOA had tried to foreclose while he was deployed to Japan. Hannah was smart, funny, and understood the work I was doing because she was doing similar work herself. Our first date was coffee that turned into a 4-hour conversation about property law, military life, and the best barbecue in Nashville. By the time spring rolled around again, a full year after I'd come home from deployment to find my house stolen, my life looked completely different than I'd imagined it would. I had a job I enjoyed, a foundation doing meaningful work, a girlfriend I was crazy about, and a neighborhood full of friends. I'd taken the worst experience of my life and turned it into something positive. Brenda Hutchinson was serving her sentence at the Tennessee Prison for Women in Nashville. I never thought about her unless someone asked about the case. She wasn't worth my mental energy. She tried to destroy my life and ended up destroying her own instead. In June, the foundation held its first annual fundraiser at a hotel in downtown Nashville. We raised over $50,000 to continue our work helping service members. The keynote speaker was a Marine colonel who dealt with an HOA issue while deployed to Afghanistan. He spoke about the unique vulnerability service members face when they deploy, trusting that their affairs at home are protected by law and basic human decency. Patrick Williams could have come home defeated, the colonel said. He could have accepted what happened to him as an unfortunate loss and moved on. Instead, he fought back, and in fighting back, he created something that's protecting service members across this state and inspiring legislative changes across the country. That's the kind of leadership we need. The applause was overwhelming. Hannah squeezed my hand under the table, and Robert leaned over to whisper, "You did good, kid." The legal requirement that Brenda pay restitution meant I received monthly payments as she liquidated assets and made payments from her prison wages, which weren't much. Every month, a small check would arrive, a reminder that justice had been served. I donated every penny to the foundation. In August, I got an unexpected call from a producer at a national news network. They wanted to do a feature story about HOA abuse and the foundation's work. I was hesitant about the publicity, but Robert and Hannah both convinced me it would help spread awareness and potentially help more service members. The segment aired in September, prime time on a weekday evening. It covered my story, interviewed several other service members we'd helped, and highlighted the Tennessee legislation. The phones at the foundation didn't stop ringing for weeks. We got calls from service members, from state legislators in other states asking about our law, and from journalists wanting to do follow-up stories. The exposure led to foundation chapters opening in Virginia, North Carolina, and Texas, all states with large military populations and active HOA communities. What had started as a response to my personal nightmare was becoming a national movement. In October, I got notification that Brenda was up for a parole hearing. She'd served 18 months of her 4-year sentence and was eligible for early release consideration. I submitted a victim impact statement opposing parole, detailing the ongoing impact her actions had on my life and the lives of other neighborhood families. Robert helped me craft it to be factual and unemotional, just laying out the scope of what she'd done. The parole board denied her release. She'd serve at least another year before being eligible again. Hannah and I got engaged on a crisp November evening. I proposed at Stones River National Battlefield, a quiet spot where we'd gone hiking several times. She said yes before I even finished the question, and we spent the rest of the day making plans and calling family. The holidays that year were special. Hannah's family welcomed me with open arms. We spent Thanksgiving with them in Knoxville and Christmas with my parents in Ohio, who flew down to meet Hannah and absolutely adored her. Ed and Mrs. Morrison hosted a neighborhood New Year's party, and standing in my neighbor's backyard surrounded by friends as fireworks exploded overhead, I thought about the journey of the past 20 months. I deployed to Kuwait as a single guy with a house and a simple life. I'd come home to find everything stolen. I'd fought back and won. I'd built a foundation to help others. I'd found love. I'd helped change state law. None of it was what I'd planned, but all of it was exactly where I needed to be. The foundation continued growing. By the 2nd anniversary of my return from deployment, we'd helped over 100 service members resolve HOA disputes. We'd prevented 4 foreclosures, recovered over $200,000 in bogus fines, and seen criminal charges filed against 7 HOA board members across 3 states for fraud and extortion. Hannah and I got married in May at a small ceremony in Murfreesboro. Ed walked me down the aisle since my father had passed away the previous winter. Robert was my best man. Half the neighborhood attended, along with family and friends from across the country. It was perfect and simple and exactly what we both wanted. We bought a house together in Franklin, a town just south of Nashville, specifically choosing a neighborhood without an HOA. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Our housewarming party included a ceremonial burning of HOA bylaws, printed from the internet specifically for the occasion. Everyone cheered as the papers went up in flames in our fire pit. Brenda Hutchinson was released on parole after serving 2.5 years of her 4-year sentence. I got a notification from the Victim Services Office, but felt nothing about it. She was someone else's problem now, and her probation conditions prevented her from ever serving in an HOA again. She'd been permanently defanged. The foundation work became my full-time job. The logistics company position had been good, but helping service members fight back against corrupt HOAs was my calling. Hannah continued her advocacy work, and together, we became a team focused on protecting service member rights from various angles. In September, 3 years after I'd come home from deployment, Tennessee held a ceremony recognizing the impact of the Service Member Protection Law. The governor presented me with a citation for my role in inspiring the legislation and helping dozens of service members through the foundation. State representatives from Virginia, North Carolina, Texas, and Georgia attended, as similar laws had passed in their states based on Tennessee's model. Standing at that podium, looking out at an audience full of service members, advocates, and legislators, I thought about that night when my key didn't work in my own front door. I thought about the rage and helplessness I'd felt. I thought about Brenda Hutchinson's smug face when she'd claimed legal right to my home. And I thought about how all of that pain and anger had been channeled into something that was helping people across the country. 3 years ago, I came home from deployment and found out a woman had stolen my house, I said into the microphone. It was the worst experience of my life up to that point, but it taught me something important. Injustice thrives when good people don't fight back. I fought back. With the help of an incredible attorney, a supportive neighborhood, and a legal system that ultimately worked the way it should, I won. But winning wasn't enough. We needed to make sure this couldn't happen to others. That's why this foundation exists. That's why these laws exist. Because service members shouldn't have to worry about someone stealing their homes while they're deployed protecting our country. The applause was thunderous. Hannah was crying in the front row. Robert gave me a thumbs up. Ed and Mrs. Morrison beamed with pride. The check from the settlement and restitution had long since been donated to the foundation, but it had grown through fundraising and grants. We had a full-time staff of 5, including 2 attorneys and a paralegal. We had volunteers across 6 states. We had a legislative advocacy arm working on additional protections. What had started with my personal crisis had become an organization helping hundreds of people. Life settled into a new rhythm. Hannah and I talked about starting a family. The foundation continued its work. I maintained close friendships with Ed and the other neighbors from my old street in Murfreesboro, even though I'd moved to Franklin. My house, the one Brenda had stolen, I kept and rented to a young Army specialist who was about to deploy. I gave him a rent discount and promised him that I'd personally make sure nothing happened to the property while he was gone. In December, 4 years after I'd first come home from deployment, I got an email from Timothy Vance, the attorney who'd represented Brenda at that first hearing. He apologized for his role in what had happened, explaining that he'd been fresh out of law school and hadn't done his due diligence in reviewing Brenda's claims. He'd since specialized in HOA law and was working to reform abusive practices from the inside. I wrote back, accepting his apology and thanking him for his current work. Everyone deserved a chance at redemption, and he was using his experience to make positive changes. The foundation's impact continued expanding. We started offering free educational seminars for service members about their rights regarding HOAs before deployment. We created a deployment checklist that included steps to protect property and finances while overseas. We partnered with military legal assistance offices to provide resources and referrals. By the 5th anniversary of my return from deployment, the Foundation had helped over 300 service members. We'd prevented 17 foreclosures. We'd recovered over $1 million in fraudulent fines. We'd contributed to legislative changes in 8 states, and we'd seen 22 HOA board members face criminal charges for fraud, extortion, or forgery. Hannah gave birth to our daughter in July. We named her Grace Patricia Williams, Patricia after Judge Morrison, who'd given me my house back. Holding my daughter in the hospital, with Hannah smiling despite her exhaustion and my heart so full I thought it might burst, I marveled at how life had unfolded. 5 years earlier, I'd come home from deployment expecting nothing more than rest and normalcy. Instead, I'd faced the biggest fight of my life, and that fight had led me here. To a wife I loved, a daughter who'd barely opened her eyes but already owned my heart completely, a foundation doing meaningful work, and a life richer than I'd ever imagined. Ed and Mrs. Morrison visited us in the hospital, bringing flowers and offering the kind of wisdom that only comes from decades of marriage and life experience. "You've built something beautiful," Mrs. Morrison said, holding Grace gently. "Not just this little one, though she's precious, but everything you've created from that terrible situation. You took something awful and made it mean something." She was right. Brenda Hutchinson had tried to steal my house, my security, and my peace. Instead, she'd inadvertently given me a purpose. The foundation was my legacy, built from the ashes of her greed and corruption. Every service member we helped was proof that good could come from bad, that fighting back mattered, that one person standing up could create ripples that turned into waves. Robert visited later that day, bringing a giant teddy bear and his characteristic grin. "She's going to be a lawyer," he predicted. "Look at those eyes. That's someone who's going to fight for what's right." "Let's let her learn to walk first," I laughed, but I hoped he was right. I hoped Grace would grow up knowing that when injustice happens, you don't accept it. You fight back. You stand up. You protect not just yourself but others who might face the same battles. The foundation continued its work. Hannah took maternity leave but stayed involved in planning and strategy. I balanced my time between the foundation office, home with my new family, and occasional speaking engagements about service member rights and HOA reform. Brenda Hutchinson finished her probation 5 years after being sentenced. I got a final notification from Victim Services that her case was closed. She'd paid all restitution, completed her sentence, and was released from supervision. I hoped she'd learned something, though I doubted it. People like her rarely changed, but it didn't matter anymore. She couldn't hurt anyone else, and that was what counted. 6 years after coming home from deployment, I stood in front of a congressional committee in Washington, D.C., testifying about the need for federal protections for service members against HOA abuse. The state laws we'd helped pass were good, but inconsistent. We needed federal standards that applied everywhere. Hannah sat in the gallery with Grace, now a rambunctious toddler who waved at me from her mother's lap. Robert sat beside them, along with several service members we'd helped over the years. Ed had made the trip from Tennessee just to support me. I told my story to the committee. I explained the current patchwork of state laws. I outlined what comprehensive federal protection should look like. And I asked them to imagine being deployed overseas, serving your country, and coming home to find everything you owned had been stolen under the pretense of HOA authority. 3 months later, the Service Member Housing Protection Act passed both houses of Congress and was signed into law. It created federal standards for HOA interactions with deployed service members, required court oversight for any enforcement actions involving deployed personnel, and established strict penalties for violations. The day the President signed that bill, I sat in my home office and cried. Hannah found me there and held me while I sobbed out 6 years of emotion, relief, and gratitude. "You did it," she whispered. "You actually did it." "We did it," I corrected. "You, me, Robert, all the service members who shared their stories, all the advocates who pushed for change. We did it together." That night, we had a small celebration at our house. Ed and Mrs. Morrison drove down from Murfreesboro. Robert brought champagne. A few other foundation board members attended. We toasted to justice, to persistence, and to the idea that one person's nightmare could become a catalyst for protecting thousands of others. Grace toddled around the party, charming everyone with her smile and her determination to steal sips from people's drinks. Watching her, I thought about the world she'd grow up in. A world where her father had faced injustice and fought back. A world where that fight had led to real, meaningful change. The Foundation's work shifted slightly after the federal law passed. We still helped individual service members, but we also focused on education and compliance, helping HOAs understand the new requirements and avoid violations. Some HOA boards were grateful for the guidance. Others resented the oversight. We didn't care about their feelings. We cared about protecting service members. Years continued passing. Grace started preschool. Hannah and I celebrated our 5th anniversary. The Foundation opened its 10th state chapter. Ed and Mrs. Morrison became our daughter's honorary grandparents, spoiling her shamelessly. Life was good, built on a foundation of resilience and purpose. I sometimes thought about that night I'd come home from deployment, tired and excited, only to find my key didn't work. I thought about the rage and fear and helplessness. Those emotions had driven me to fight, and that fight had changed everything. Brenda Hutchinson had tried to take my home. Instead, she'd given me a mission. She tried to defeat me and had instead made me stronger. She'd thought she could use her petty authority to crush someone who couldn't fight back, and she'd been wrong. 8 years after coming home from deployment, I received a letter forwarded through the Foundation. It was from Brenda. I almost threw it away without reading it, but curiosity won. The letter was surprisingly brief. She wrote that she'd been following the Foundation's work and the legislative changes. She acknowledged that what she'd done was wrong and had caused harm to many people. She said she hoped the good that had come from the situation provided some measure of peace to those she'd hurt. She didn't ask for forgiveness or try to justify her actions. It was just a simple acknowledgement. I read it twice, then filed it away. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. That chapter of my life was closed, but its impact continued rippling outward in positive ways. The Foundation had become something bigger than any of us had imagined. It had inspired similar organizations focusing on different aspects of service member rights. It had changed laws in dozens of states and at the federal level. It had helped thousands of service members and their families avoid or fight back against HOA abuse, and it had given me a purpose beyond anything I'd planned for myself. I'd gone from a soldier doing his job to an advocate fighting for others who faced similar battles. That transformation, born from crisis and injustice, was the best thing that ever happened to me, even though I'd never have chosen it. Standing in my backyard in Franklin on a warm evening, watching Grace play while Hannah gardened and Ed told stories from the old neighborhood, I felt contentment that ran bone deep. Life had thrown me something terrible, and I'd built something beautiful from the wreckage. That was the real victory, not the court case I'd won or the money I'd recovered, not even the laws that had changed. The real victory was that Brenda Hutchinson's attempt to destroy me had instead revealed strength I didn't know I had and led me to a life richer than I'd ever imagined possible. She'd tried to take my home. She'd failed. And in failing, she'd given me something much more valuable, proof that fighting back matters, that justice is possible, and that from the worst moments can come unexpected gifts. My house in Murfreesboro, the one she'd stolen, still stood. The young specialist I'd rented it to had returned from deployment safe and sound, just as I'd promised to protect his interests. He'd since moved on, and the house was now rented to a Marine deploying to Okinawa. I continued the tradition of discounted rent and personal oversight, paying forward the support I'd received. The neighborhood there had continued to thrive without an oppressive HOA. Property values had actually increased, proving that tyrannical enforcement wasn't necessary for maintaining a nice community. People took care of their homes because they wanted to, not because they feared arbitrary fines. Ed called me at least once a week with updates from the old neighborhood. The Ramirez kids were in high school now. Mr. Cooper had fully recovered and was mentoring young veterans at the local VFW. The Hendersons had added a pool to their backyard without asking anyone's permission, and it was glorious. These were the stories that mattered. Not Brenda's defeat, though that had been necessary, but the lives that continued and improved because one person had stood up and refused to accept injustice. The Foundation's work continued, ever evolving to meet new challenges. HOA abuses took different forms across the country, and we adapted to address them. We'd become experts not just in service member protections but in broader HOA reform, advocating for transparency, accountability, and reasonable governance. Robert eventually retired from his law firm but stayed active with the Foundation as senior counsel. He'd made enough from our case and others to live comfortably, but he continued working because, as he put it, someone has to keep the bastards honest. Hannah's advocacy work expanded too. She became state director for a veterans services organization, working on issues ranging from health care to education to housing. Together, we were a formidable team, both professionally and personally. Grace grew up surrounded by stories of standing up for what's right, of fighting back against injustice, of turning bad situations into opportunities for positive change. She learned early that her father's work wasn't just a job, but a calling born from personal experience. On the 10th anniversary of my return from deployment, the Foundation held a major event in Nashville. Over 500 people attended, including service members we'd helped, legislators who'd sponsored protection laws, and advocates from across the country. The keynote speaker was a 4-star general who dealt with an HOA issue early in his career and credited the Foundation with preventing similar situations for current service members. Standing on that stage, looking out at hundreds of faces, I told my story one more time. But I also told the stories of the other service members we'd helped. The Air Force captain whose HOA tried to foreclose while he was deployed to Afghanistan. The Navy sailor whose association fined her for having a military flag in her window. the army sergeant whose HOA attempted to seize his property while he was in Kuwait, just like they'd done to me. Each story ended with victory, with justice, with laws changed and wrongs righted. Each story proved that fighting back mattered. 10 years ago, I came home from deployment and found someone had stolen my house, I said, the opening line I'd used dozens of times in speeches and interviews. It was the worst night of my life, but from that night came everything good that's happened since. This foundation, these laws. All of you. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us become the catalyst for the best things we'll ever do. That woman thought she was taking something from me. Instead, she gave me a purpose I'll spend the rest of my life fulfilling. The standing ovation lasted several minutes. Hannah was crying again, the way she always did at these events. Grace, now 8 years old and sitting in the front row, beamed with pride. Ed and Mrs. Morrison looked like they might burst with happiness. After the event, dozens of people came up to thank me personally. Service members who'd avoided HOA problems because of our education efforts. Homeowners who'd fought back against abusive boards using resources we'd provided. Legislators who'd crafted better laws based on our model legislation. Each conversation reminded me why the work mattered. Each handshake and hug reinforced that fighting back had been the right choice. I could have accepted what happened to me, moved on, and lived with the injustice. Hundreds of people would have been worse off if I had. That night, lying in bed with Hannah beside me and Grace asleep down the hall, I thought about the journey from that terrible homecoming to this moment of triumph and satisfaction. 10 years of work, advocacy, and fighting for others. 10 years of watching laws change and lives improve. 10 years of turning anger into purpose. Brenda Hutchinson was out there somewhere, living her life under the shadow of her conviction and the permanent restrictions on her ability to ever wield that kind of petty authority again. I hoped she'd found some measure of peace, though I doubted it. People like her rarely changed fundamentally. But she couldn't hurt anyone else, and that was enough. The foundation's work would continue long after I was gone. We'd built something sustainable, with dedicated staff, engaged board members, and a mission that resonated with people across the country. Service members would always need advocates, and HOAs would always need oversight to prevent abuse. My story had become part of a larger narrative about standing up to injustice, about protecting those who serve, about refusing to accept wrong simply because fighting back is hard. It wasn't just my story anymore. It belonged to everyone who'd been helped, everyone who'd fought alongside us, everyone who demanded better from the systems meant to serve communities rather than oppress them. Looking back, I wouldn't change what happened, as strange as that sounds. The pain and anger of that night were real and terrible, but they led to everything that came after: love, purpose, meaningful work, and the satisfaction of knowing that my fight had helped countless others avoid similar battles. Brenda Hutchinson had tried to take my home. She'd failed spectacularly, and in her failure, she'd inadvertently created something far more valuable than any house. A movement to protect service members, reform corrupt HOAs, and prove that one person refusing to accept injustice can change the world. That was my legacy. Not as a victim of HOA abuse, but as someone who fought back and won, who built something lasting from a terrible situation, who proved that justice is possible when people refuse to give up. And every night, when I locked the door of my home in Franklin, Tennessee, with my wife and daughter safe inside and my work continuing to help others, I felt grateful. Grateful for the fight I'd won, the purpose I'd found, and the life I'd built from the wreckage of that terrible homecoming 10 years ago. The key worked perfectly in my lock. My family was safe and happy. Justice had been served. And somewhere out there, service members were deploying with confidence that their homes would be protected, their rights would be defended, and if someone tried to take advantage of their service, there were people ready to fight back. That was enough. That was everything. That was victory.